Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and a pleasure to be here with Jonathan Sarna and to discuss his wonderful book, When General Grant Expelled the Jews. That General Grant expelled the Jews, until your book came along, is not a widely remembered fact, I imagine, among American Jews, let alone amongst Americans generally. Can you start by giving us some of the basics of the story?
Sure, and in fact, it's appropriate to do so. Let me also say how grateful I am to the museum for this program and to all of you for coming. Really, we're about to commemorate the 150th anniversary of General Orders number 11. The order was delivered on December the 17th, 1862, and it read, "The Jews as a class, violating every regulation of trade established by the Treasury Department and also department orders, are hereby expelled from the department within 24 hours from the receipt of this order." Grant's territory was a large area, really extending from the Mississippi River to the Tennessee River, from North Cairo, Illinois, and Paducah, really moving south. Grant was, of course, on his way to Vicksburg. Grant believed that smuggling was really keeping the South alive, and because some of the smugglers whom his troops caught were Jews, he concluded all Jews were smugglers, and indeed one can see in his writing and in a lot of Southern writing that Jew became a synonym for smuggler, and even smugglers who were not Jewish were called Jews, just like Northerners who were certainly not Yankees became in Southern parlance Yankees. So Jew became that term, which embraced smugglers and people who cheated the army in various ways. All were Jews. Grant was concerned about them. He's a general. He decided that he would solve the problem by expelling Jews as a class, which he does. Now, eventually, fortunately for Jews, no sooner is the order issued than his troops, that is Grant's troops at Holly Springs, are attacked. And as part of those attacks, the telegraph lines for 50 miles around are cut. So the order actually spreads very slowly. And most people don't know about it, but eventually it takes 11 days for the order to hit Paducah, Kentucky. It sounds like today's mail, the 11 days from Holly Springs to Paducah. But eventually the order gets to Paducah. Paducah is a community, about 30 Jewish families, many of whom supported the Union. And indeed, the expulsion hits Paducah, and one of those Jews, who's really the hero in a way of that chapter, is a Jew named Caesar Caskell, a staunch Union supporter, who is ordered, given 24 hours to leave Paducah, and it is he who both sends a telegram to Abraham Lincoln, and maybe because he's a merchant, he knew about public relations, so he spreads the word to the newspapers. He writes a press release that goes out on the AP wire, and indeed he goes down to Washington and really goes in to see Abraham Lincoln, and it's really quite amazing. He figures out that he should go and see a congressman who's friendly to Lincoln, and he does, and they go over on a Saturday night to see Abraham Lincoln, And years later, he preserves this amazing dialogue that he had with Lincoln, a reminder of how Lincoln knew his Bible, and when he saw Jews, he thought back to the Bible. So according to what he preserves, Lincoln says, "And so the children of Israel were driven from the happy land of Canaan." And Gaskell, who was no fool, says, "Yes, and that is why we have come unto Father Abraham's bosom, asking protection." And Lincoln replies, "And this protection they shall have at once." Even if the dialogue didn't exactly go the way it was remembered years later, it is certainly the case that Lincoln immediately orders that the order be overturned, and he counteracts the order. And Halleck, who was general-in-chief of the army, Henry Halleck, tells Grant, using the subjunctive, which is a proof that they had not seen the order. They weren't even sure if there was such an order. Caesar Gaskell brings them a copy, but they've never seen it. So Halleck writes to Grant, "If such an order has been issued, it will be immediately revoked." And Grant, of course, revokes the order. I spoke in Washington at the National Archives on this book a few weeks ago and wondered aloud whether Washington today could respond as quickly as it did then between December the 28th and January the 3rd. The whole thing is revoked, and Gaskell goes back to Paducah.
Before we go further with the story, maybe you could set the stage a little bit more by telling us who were the Jews in America in 1862, and how were they situated with regard to the conflict that was happening?
So, by the eve of the Civil War, there are probably 150,000 Jews in America. Most of them knew. There were 15,000 in 1840, probably not more than 3,000 in 1820. So it gives you a sense of the growth. Most of these Jews are new immigrants from Central Europe, the lands of Germany and Poland, who are fairly recent. Most of them are in the north, but you do have maybe 25,000, 30,000 in the south. And that is in the areas of the Confederacy. Many of these Jews had been peddlers, which of course is why they knew how to smuggle. There's no question there were Jews who smuggled. There were a lot of non-Jews who smuggled. You could make a huge amount of money smuggling from the south to the north and the north to the south. And anyone who was able to do it did it. A lot of soldiers did it. Butler, the famous general, got his brother became very rich in the war. Also smuggling cotton and other things. So in any case, these Jews are enough. They're easily recognized by their foreign accents, by their distinctive ways, and I think did stand out. And many Jews are involved in trade of one kind or another. Adam Mendelsohn has recently shown us how important Jews were in the clothing trade of the Civil War, and obviously the Civil War gives a huge boost to ready-made clothing because you're clothing the troops, and Jews were totally disproportionate in getting contracts to clothe the troops, and naturally were blamed if the uniforms turned out to be poor quality, and that certainly happened at times. Lots of Jews, not only Jews, but lots of Jews were what were called sutlers, meaning that they helped to set up the stores that sold provisions to the troops in the field. Many of even the pictures of Sutler's store make clear that these are Jews, and we have quite a few Jews who we know. Rice, for example, we even have his little coins that he gave out. He had his own currency, and that survives. So Jews were sutlers, and clearly there were Jewish smugglers as well who were trying to benefit from this situation. As I say, the problem was that instead of expelling Jewish smugglers, Grant expelled Jews as a class, which was a very different thing. Had he expelled smugglers, Jews and non-Jewish, we probably wouldn't be here.
That's right.
That's what generals wanted to do. But instead of doing that, he expelled Jews as a class. The most anti-Semitic official order in all of American history, the only time Jews as a class have been expelled from anywhere in the United States.
So the whole episode was very short-lived as an expulsion. Were Jews expelled? Did Jews have to leave their homes? How many were affected, and what kinds of hardships did they experience?
So it's a very good question. One of the early questions I had in researching the book was, how come so few? I mean, Memphis is one of the largest Jewish communities in the South. It's in that territory, but the Jews were not expelled from Memphis. Certainly there are stories, and I have them in the book, of Jewish traders in the area of Holly Springs who are rather roughly treated, even one or two women who give accounts clearly showing that they're rather molested on their way out, their effects stolen, and so forth. The Jewish community was certainly shocked, but it's not a large number, and the reason I think it's not a large number is this good fortune that the telegraph lines are cut, and therefore the order is not widely disseminated, and by the time the lines are back, Caesar Caskell has had the order overturned. Paducah, all of them, including, we should say, since we're here at this museum, one of the leading figures in this museum is Henry Morgenthau of New York, and one of his ancestors, a man named Fatman, was in Paducah, and the Morgenthau family actually preserves a copy of the order expelling them from Paducah. So Paducah is the place where we know Jews were expelled from, and women and children were expelled. Supposedly, one or two are forgotten or too old to move, and so on. The historian of Paducah preserves a somewhat dubious story, but it's a good story. I tend to think these stories that are only found in the 20th century, you always ask, how come no one knew them in the 19th century? But he preserves this 20th century story that when the troops go looking for Jews, they knock on a door, and they knock on the door of somebody and they say, "What are you?" And the guy says, "Tailor." The soldier, who's not very bright, says, "Oh, sorry to bother you, Mr. Tailor. I'm looking for Jews." And so on. But that's really where most of the stories that are remembered are either remembered by people who were passing through the area for one purpose or another and are forced to leave, or the Jews of Paducah. But the Jews of Memphis are unscathed. Had the order not been overturned as quickly as it was, that might have been very different.
You tell another story which I found striking. When Caesar Caskell returns to Paducah, he's stopped at the entry gate or the road entering in, and the guard says, "Who allowed you to come back?" And he says,
"By order of the President of the United States." And it is, and he clearly remembered that. I mean, this is an example of how a man we never would hear about. It's really a historic example of how a man can become famous, or person can become famous in 1 hour, really. 1 minute. It was a clothing business. Later, he had a store here in New York. Not a person we would hear about, but he becomes the hero of this case. He argues it before Lincoln. Lincoln overturns it, and he, has this whole experience. And I'm sure he told the story many times from his store here in New York when he moved here. And it is recorded. Supposedly, I found evidence that he had, written it down somewhere, and that there were documents. And Bertram W. Coyne, the great Civil War historian, tried to get them, and I have a letter in which the woman wants to sell them, but not otherwise provide them. And those documents have vanished. I've been in touch with a few. I don't know if there are any Caskills here, but I even put two Caskill descendants in touch with one another. They didn't know of each other, but none of them know what happened to the documents. I mention it because if you have rare documents from the Civil War, don't keep them in your attic. They'll disappear, but give them to Jonathan Karp so they can be properly preserved. I fear that this very rare Civil War document has just been thrown out like so much else, which is truly tragic. But I did nevertheless manage to put together, I think, much of the story from other sources.
Well, one can't help but notice the proximity of this episode to a far more famous moment in Civil War history, which is fast approaching, the anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. So here we have a juxtaposition of an expulsion, however short-lived, of Jews of one minority as a class indiscriminately, and both the proclamation by the president essentially declaring an end to slavery. How did this play out in terms of the press coverage of both, in terms of the reaction of American Jews? How does it fit into our understanding of the complex relationship between blacks and Jews in this period?
Right, and it's a very important question, and I'll say first that most of the earlier writing on this didn't even notice the juxtaposition, a reminder of how important it is to look at Jewish history within a larger context. December the 17th is this order, General Order Number 11. January 1st is the promulgation of the Emancipation Proclamation. At least one American newspaper in Memphis publishes the two, one above the other. And what's really fascinating and understandable is the Jews imagined that those two events are linked. In their mind, it was perfectly clear. Oh, now we're going to give equality, we're going to free the slaves, we're going to give equality to African Americans. The new fall guys in America are going to be the Jews. In their mind, those events were linked. And indeed, and I say openly, it's very ugly material where some leading rabbis really wonder aloud whether the real purpose of the Civil War is to elevate the blacks at the expense of the Jews, and wonder at the linkage that they saw in their mind between these two events. Of course, once Lincoln overturns the order, it's clear that this is not going to happen, and clearly that's not the way events moved. but it reminds us that really, from the Civil War onwards, blacks and Jews are interrelated, and I have quite a lot of material here, much of it new, on the relationship of blacks and Jews. So, for example, later, Ulysses S. Grant appoints Jews to a kind of mindless, sounds like a mindless office of, but it had significant power, and the recorder of deeds of the District of Columbia. But that becomes a federal office, and for a while it's held by Jews, and then it becomes held by African Americans, which is really interesting. It moves from the one, and Frederick Douglass actually eventually holds that position, and it becomes an office held by, the office, I would say, the token office,
right,
held by African Americans all the way down to Harry Truman's day. So again, you see a kind of linkage between blacks and Jews that one sees from the moment this order is issued.
Now, what we've discussed so far, for the most part, are the bare bones of the story, but your book is really about much more. It's about Ulysses S. Grant and his relationship with Jews moving beyond this initial episode. And one of the fascinating features of that is Grant's own personal history and his own family history. And you suggest that part of the psychological motivation for the order may have derived from his relationship with his father. Can you explain that?
Yeah. One of the questions is, why does he suddenly expel Jews on December the 17th? If you read Grant's papers, sure, he's unhappy about Jews, and he warns Sherman against these Jewish traitors, we shouldn't allow any of these smugglers. But why does he expel them on December 17th? And the interesting thing is, a few weeks earlier, he had overturned an expulsion order in a very narrow area by one of his, Colonel Du Bois, who also wanted to expel Jews and smugglers and so on. So what happens on December 17th? So it turns out that just at that time, his father, whose name was Jesse Grant, has cooked up a scheme to get some money from moving Southern cotton northward. And Grant says, well, that's easy. I'll get my son to give me a pass to move the cotton. And he hooks up, and actually there's no question that the Jews thought up this idea, the Mack family, the clothing manufacturers of Cincinnati. If you're in clothing, you need cotton. And there was a lot of money to be made. So they make a deal with Jesse Grant. He'll get 25% of the profits. He'll help them to get the cotton and move it to New York. He doesn't have to go to New York, just get him a pass. They'll give him 25% of the profits. Fine. So Jesse and the three Macks come to Grant's headquarters in Holly Springs. Well, of course, Ulysses, he's been trying to prevent smuggling and suddenly sees, my God, my own father is engaged in this, and he's cooked up a deal with the Jews. So in some respects, instead of expelling his father, he expels the Jews. But the relationship, of course, of Ulysses S. Grant and his father was very complicated. Anyone who reads the letters or the biography can see that. The father never thought Ulysses would amount to much and was always giving him advice and telling him what to do. And of course, Ulysses had failed at almost everything except being a general. But there's no question that explains the timing and gives a certain explanation of what was going on. There are other explanations that have surfaced over the years, but I think this one is the one that is best documented and most likely.
It also fits in very well to what you were describing earlier, a situation of widespread smuggling participated in by all kinds of groups, including Jews, but the effort to somehow stereotype Jews as the exclusive purveyors of this activity, especially when one's own family is tainted by it in reality.
Right. And, you know, in the history of anti-Semitism, this is not a unique, not a unique event. And so it fits in with a larger story that we know.
Now, Grant returns, in a sense, to the national spotlight long after the assassination of Lincoln and the debacle of the Andrew Johnson presidency. 1868, there's an election, and Grant is the candidate for the Republican, the nominee for the Republican Party, and General Orders 11 becomes one of the issues. I can't help but, if you'll allow me to read a bit of verse that you quote in the book.
Right.
This
I
is
didn't
from
write the verse.
No, you didn't write it. But this is from a Wisconsin newspaper. This is from a Democratic newspaper. Who drove the Hebrews from his camp into the alligator swamp where everything was dark and damp? Ulysses. Who wroth thee at the faithless Jews? Who kept Pa's share of cotton dues? All further permits did refuse. Ulysses. So how did the issue of General Orders 11 play out in this election?
This is really what I found so fascinating, that the issue returns when Grant runs for president, and it's, of course, the first time that a Jewish issue stands front and center in a presidential contest. All sorts of people who never knew anything about General Orders number 11 in 1862, when, after all, lots of other things were going on and the Emancipation Proclamation steals the headlines, hear about the order in 1868 when the Democrats use it as a way of tarnishing the reputation of this great man who supposedly had won the Civil War for the Union, and the Democrats want to defeat him. This is perfect for them. They say, you know, Grant is a person who expels minorities and so on. Now, from a Jewish point of view, this was very difficult because, after all, the Republicans were more liberal. They had policies on Reconstruction that allowed blacks to vote, that allowed them to hold office, that were attempting really to transform the character of the ex-slaves by giving them great liberty. The Democrats want to take all of that away from African Americans. They claim that blacks shouldn't vote, that they should be in a secondary position. They tell blacks, don't vote for the Democrats. We're the party of the white man. So suddenly, the Jews have a problem. Should we vote for a party that's bad for the country, meaning the Democrats, just to avoid voting for a man who'd been bad for the Jews, meaning Grant? And actually, there is significant debate. Two rabbis debate the issue. One really arguing that you vote on the basis of national interest. When you go into the ballot box, you don't vote as a Jew. You vote on the basis of what's good for the country. And the other rabbi, who's Isaac Mayer Wise, insisting that wrong is wrong, and a person who expelled Jews from the country didn't deserve the Jewish vote. And one can see Jews dividing on this issue. It's really the very first time that we see so much debate over the Jewish vote. Of course, the irony is there can't be more than 70,000 Jewish voters, if that. But in 1868, as in 2012, the size of the Jewish vote is greatly exaggerated by pundits. And so there's a lot of discussion about it.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, even writing it, I was aware of how contemporary some of it sounded. At the end of the day, Jews probably divided their vote. Nobody really knows, and they didn't take decent polls. A lot of Jews could not bring themselves to vote for Grant. But of course, Grant wins by quite a lot, a much larger margin than most people thought he would win by. That also has a contemporary ring. And the Jewish vote didn't have anything to do with that election, was utterly unimportant, contrary to what people expected. If anything, the black vote in 1868, blacks were still voting then, and most of them undoubtedly voted for Grant. That had more impact. But then is the surprise, because after the election is over, Grant hasn't said one word publicly. Some of his advisors have, but he thought it's not appropriate to pander to any group. It was a different day in terms of what candidates did in running for office. But after the election is over, we see Grant telling Jews what they had always wanted to hear from the beginning. In late November, and it's in every paper, often on the front page. I don't just mean Jewish papers. How often does a president apologize to a group? And he says, I do not pretend to sustain that order. I have no prejudice against sect or race, but want each individual to be judged by his own merit. And Jews take that as an apology, and the truth is that was reasonable. Look around the world. Did Tsar Nicholas ever send such a letter to the Jews? The whole thing is unthinkable. So, Ferdinand and Isabella never sent such a letter. So here they get here they get this, and then the question is, well, is Grant serious? I mean, is this a real apology or just politics?